Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started here. My name is Bob Ferguson. I'm president of Science and Public Policy Institute. Welcome to our session. What I'd like to do is give more time to the speakers and more time to all of you to give them Q&A. Their bios, you can read for yourself if you don't mind, page 21 and page 23 of the conference handbook. And I think we're going to start, who's going to start first, Marlo? Okay, we're going to have probably Marlo and...
Yeah, if Ross isn't here, I'll
Okay, Marlo, David, and Ross. I don't know where Ross McKittrick is, but I'm sure he'll be showing up. So let's go ahead and get started. What we've been asked to do is have a group Q&A at the end, so each of the people will give their presentations. Brian will have the time cards, gentlemen. He'll wave them at you, arrest you if you go over. Brian will have the time cards, so you know.
What sort of time are we looking at? 20 minutes?
20 minutes apiece. So we do 20 minutes for each speaker, and then we'll have an open Q&A with all three. So enjoy.
Whoops. I guess I don't need to move that. I guess I'm pretty loud as it is. Well, thank you all for coming to this panel. I'm Marlo Lewis, and in your brochure, it says that what I'm going to talk about is the economic train wreck of EPA regulation of carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act. That's a correct characterization of what I'll talk about, although I decided to rename it the constitutional crisis, because I think the constitutional crisis is really the root cause of this economic train wreck. And why am I calling this a constitutional crisis? Well, for two reasons. One is that the decision of Massachusetts versus EPA, which has now set the stage for EPA regulation of carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act, I believe was a case of legislation from the bench, of judicial activism and overdrive of the sort we really haven't seen since maybe the Dred Scott decision. Okay, so I mean, I think it's that outrageous, and I'll talk about that in a little while. And the other reason is that if you read the EPA's advance notice of proposed rulemaking, where they describe how it is they'd go about regulating carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act, they acknowledge that there is, or they almost acknowledge, if you read between the lines, that there is this economic train wreck potential in applying the Clean Air Act to carbon dioxide, but they think that they can use a variety of administrative remedies to prevent the law from working out according to its own internal logic. In other words, that EPA would have to assume legislative power and amend the statute. So it would be, in my view, a clear violation of the separation of powers. So for those two reasons, I view this as a constitutional crisis. And I just wanted to give you here the bare bones of Massachusetts EPA. This was the case that was decided back in April the 2nd of 2007. It's too bad it couldn't have been decided just one day sooner, then we could all have a good laugh as well. But basically the Supreme Court decided, incorrectly as I'll argue, that greenhouse gases are air pollutants within the meaning of the Clean Air Act. Hence, EPA has the authority to regulate them. And so now EPA has to decide whether or not air pollution, this is how tortured the semantics gets, whether air pollution from greenhouse gases may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. And if EPA does make that decision, it will have to promulgate first ever greenhouse gas emission standards for new motor vehicles. Of course, EPA can also not make an endangerment finding if it determines that there's some statutory reason why it should not. And here's a bunch of statutory reasons. I'm not going to go through them all here, but if anyone is interested in pursuing this subject in more detail, you could look at my comment that I submitted to the EPA on its advance notice of proposed rulemaking on CEI's website. Just go to cei.org, look at studies, and then scroll down, maybe 15 entries or so, and you'll see the Competitive Enterprise Institute's comment that we submitted to EPA. And another amazingly good source, and you can also find my comment there along with many others that are very worth reading, is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce website. It's uschamber.com/CO2. So that's the important thing, the CO2, and there's a whole bunch of expert comments. But basically, the reason why EPA should reject this or should not make an endangerment finding, but they're likely to do so, maybe in the next 2 months, is that it would set the stage for multiple policy disasters that Congress never intended and never approved when it enacted the relevant provision of the Clean Air Act. In this case, it happens to be Section 202, which deals with motor vehicle emissions, enacted in 1970, amended in 1977. There is no way in hell that Congress in 1970 or 1977 authorized EPA to carry out a Kyoto on steroids carbon suppression program for the United States. But that's what an endangerment finding would eventually lead to if the logic of the Clean Air Act is allowed to work its way out. And so my view is that if this had been clearly presented to the justices back in 2006 and early 2007, if they had known that they were about to create a Pandora's box, which obviously Congress had never intended when it enacted and amended the Clean Air Act or the relevant provision of the case, this Section 202, the justices would have decided differently. And also because, as I said, and as I'll try to describe in a little bit, there is no way that EPA could manage a carbon regulation program under the Clean Air Act and not cause an economic train wreck unless EPA decided to play legislator. So there are a number of reasons. Now, I just want to point out, I think that the Massachusetts versus EPA was wrongly decided for a number of reasons, but I want to just acquaint you here with really the linchpin on which the whole case rested. This was an interpretation of the most general provision of the Clean Air Act, the definition of air pollutant. This is Section 302G. And it's really hard to read selectively a provision this short. It's only 2 sentences long, but somehow the Supremes, or at least 5 of the Supremes, because it was a 5-4 decision, were able to read this heretically in the literal sense. They picked and choose. They picked out the parts that they liked and edited out the parts they didn't like. The parts in red are the parts that they ignored when they rendered this decision. Because again here, the real linchpin of this case was the determination that greenhouse gases are air pollutants within the meaning of the Clean Air Act and hence subject to regulation by the EPA if EPA made certain determinations as to their dangerousness, okay? What the provision says that an air pollutant means any air pollution agent or combination of such agents, all right, that are emitted into or otherwise enter the ambient air. Now, what's an air pollution agent? Well, that's never defined in the Clean Air Act, but it doesn't have to be because that's just a plain English usage. An agent is something that causes something or that contributes to some effect, okay? So they decided to edit that out so that the term air pollutant means any substance which is emitted into or enters the ambient air. And so carbon dioxide is a substance that's emitted, so it's an air pollutant, all right? But they begged the question, which should have been front and center because it's right in the first sentence of this definition. Is carbon dioxide an air pollution agent? Is it something that causes or contributes to air pollution, all right? Then they also just completely ignored the second sentence, which says basically, if something is a precursor to something else that's an air pollutant, it too is an air pollutant, okay? Now, there would be no need for that second sentence if anything emitted is per se an air pollutant. You wouldn't have to specify that precursors to air pollutants are also air pollutants because precursors are also emitted. So this this then tortured reading of this provision, which again is the most abstract provision in the entire Clean Air Act, adopted in 1970, has now been turned into the lever for completely revising the nation's energy markets, the nation's environmental programs, and even our economy. I think this is just the craziest. This is from bizarro world, folks, that somehow this abstract definition Bowdlerized, okay, expurgated, edited to death, adopted in 1970, is now a mandate to go forward with something that is much more intrusive and costly than the Kyoto Protocol. I mean, words fail me when I try to describe how crazy this situation is that we face. And just to emphasize the point here, what they did was they turned this definition into something that was hopelessly circular. So if you look at this again, the way they've read it is the term air pollutant means any air pollutant, okay? Because they treated air pollution agent and air pollutant as synonymous. Okay, so that's, I mean, in other words, the Supremes then assumed that Congress didn't know how to write, okay? But worse than that is, and Justice Scalia brought this out in his dissent, he said under the majority's reading of that definition of air pollutant, then anything emitted into the air, from frisbees to flatulence, qualifies as an air pollutant. And it's even more absurd than that, because if you think about it, imagine a machine, and you might think that a catalytic converter might qualify, all right, that takes dirty air, filters it, purifies it, and emits clean air out the other end. Because the clean air is emitted under the majority's reading, the clean air is now an air pollutant. Think about that. Zero pollution air, if it is emitted, is an air pollutant according to the majority's interpretation of this definition, because they're saying any substance emitted is by definition an air pollutant. So they've turned the definition into a circular formalism whereby something can be an air pollutant even if it in no way pollutes the air. All right, enough on that. I just wanted to share with you what I think is the proper disrespect for this decision, which has brought us to this precipice. Okay, now, one of the things that happened in the case is that the petitioners, which were all these state attorneys general, 12 state attorneys general, and a baker's dozen of environmental groups, they told the justices, don't worry, there's no economic risks in siding with us when we say that greenhouse gases are air pollutants and that EPA must start setting greenhouse gas emission standards for motor vehicles, because the part of the Clean Air Act that we're litigating under, which is Title II, remember I referred to Section 202, which deals with motor vehicle emissions, that's where it occurs. Title II is entirely separate from Title I, which is the National Ambient Air Quality Standards part of the Clean Air Act. And they also said, don't worry, because Section 202 requires EPA to consider compliance costs and lead times when it's setting emission standards for motor vehicles. So there's nothing to worry about. We're just dealing with one subset of emission sources, new motor vehicles, under one provision, that's all. And because the justices bought this, they decided that a previous decision that they had made, Brown versus Williamson, no longer applied to this case. In that case, what the justices decided was that if there were some regulatory decision of enormous economic and political magnitude, that you shouldn't assume that that Congress had somehow delegated that authority to an administrative agency, especially in not in a cryptic fashion, because and there's nothing more cryptic, let me tell you, than the mandate in the Clean Air Act for EPA to go regulate greenhouse gases. It's totally cryptic because the term greenhouse gases never even occurs in the Clean Air Act, okay? And carbon dioxide is mentioned once in a non-regulatory provision with a caveat, don't infer pollution control authority from this one mention. I mean, so in other words, the Brown versus Williamson, I think, was very applicable to this case, but persuaded by the plaintiffs, by the petitioners, that there was no economic risks, the court decided that an endangerment finding would lead to, quote, no extreme measures. So don't bother us with all this talk about, you know, potential economic consequences, much less a train wreck. In reality, what you find is that, well, and here I'll just jump ahead. What you find is that if you regulate greenhouse gases under almost any provision of the Clean Air Act, including Section 202, which just deals with new motor vehicles, you have made carbon dioxide a regulated pollutant. All right, this truly is a tautology which is unobjectionable. If you regulate carbon dioxide under any provision of the Clean Air Act, then it is a Clean Air Act regulated pollutant. And the way the Clean Air Act works is that once that happens, then, except in one case which we don't have to concern ourselves with here, any stationary source that emits 250 tons of this pollutant, or has actually just the potential to emit 250 tons of this pollutant a year, is subject to regulation under a part of the Clean Air Act called the Prevention of Significant Deterioration Program. This is a pre-construction permitting program. In other words, if a firm wants to build a stationary source of a regulated, of a pollutant that's regulated under the Clean Air Act, and it has the potential to emit 250 tons a year, the source first has to get a permit, what's called a Prevention of Significant Deterioration, or PSD permit. And that's a very complicated, long, drawn-out process. It's up to the firm to do a complicated analysis of this. The same thing applies if the firm just wants to modify a major stationary source. And what about, what's included in major stationary sources? Well, the cutoff, as I said, is 250 tons a year. Now, if you're dealing with traditional air pollutants like sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and so on, only large industrial facilities like power plants, refineries, have to worry about the PSD program. But if you're dealing with carbon dioxide, well then, anybody who uses, and this is what the U.S. Chamber calculated in a study that they did, anybody that uses about $70,000 worth of fossil fuel a year to heat a facility, or for cooking, if you're a restaurant, for example, you emit, you not only have the potential to emit, you actually emit 250 tons a year. And so what we're looking at is now a universe of sources subject to the Clean Air Act, which include, subject to the Prevention of Significant Deterioration Program, which includes 1 million mid-sized to large commercial buildings. This building we're in right now would have needed a PSD permit, all right, to have been built. 200,000 manufacturing operations, 17,000 large farms. In other words, 1.2 million previously unregulated buildings and facilities. Walmart, office buildings, malls. I mean, the local Dunkin' Donuts, if they use natural gas for cooking. Now, here's where the economic train wreck comes in. EPA currently processes about 200 to 300 of these PSD permits a year. Its advance notice of proposed rulemaking says that if that were just increased by an order of magnitude to 2,000 to 3,000 a year, this would impose significant new costs and administrative burdens on EPA and the other agencies, the state agencies. 2 minutes left? All right. And that this would create uncertainty and delay for all these sources, all right? Now, if just 1%, though, of the 1.2 million entities qualifying as major stationary sources have to jump through this hoop, then we're talking about 12,000 permits a year. And that would be an administrative quagmire that would bring development, economic development in this country to a screeching halt. I can't think of a more potent de-stimulus package. I guess I'm running out of time. The point I wanted to bring out here, and I'll just state it because I don't have time to work through it, is that EPA comes up with a whole bunch of dodges, administrative remedies, for not having to apply the permitting process to all the sources which are eligible, which would be eligible. And they all amount to basically EPA rewriting the statute. The most extreme example of this is EPA says, well, we know it says 250 tons is the cutoff, but we think 100,000 tons would be more reasonable, okay? And so here's the crisis again in a nutshell. We could end up with a Kyoto on steroids regulatory system without the people's elected representatives ever voting for it or taking responsibility for the burdens. And because the court has legislated this, has foisted this on us, EPA then must play legislator in order to avoid turning the Clean Air Act into the world's biggest anti-stimulus package. Now, I could have talked, if maybe in the Q&A I could talk also about how the endangerment finding, which is the prerequisite for regulating motor vehicle emissions, could also set the predicate, establish a legal precedent for a national ambient air quality standards rulemaking for carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, which could basically, which would be tantamount to a mandate to deindustrialize the United States. EPA also tries to explain why it wouldn't really have to do that, again doing violence to the statute. And finally, I just want to say, bring us to our kind of our action item. Where this is all playing out right now is that the environmental extremists, if you might call them that, are trying to use the threat of this economic train wreck as an extortion tool. I call it legislative thuggery. They're basically saying, oh, you don't want to let the Clean Air Act destroy your economy? Well, then preempt the Clean Air Act. But do that, the only way to do that will be to enact our cap and trade bill, okay? So it's kind of like, it's like one of those, like from The Godfather, it's a pretty nice economy you got there, or that you used to have. Shame if something bad were to happen to it. Everybody needs protection. You need protection. It's called Lieberman-Warner, or whatever the bill of the day is. And I think what our task must be now is to call their bluff. I really don't think the Obama administration wants to take ownership of this train wreck. And so we shouldn't let them frighten us into supporting legislation which we think is horrible on the merits. Let's have a debate on each cap and trade bill on its own merits, but before we debate that on the merits, take this gun away from our head called greenhouse gas regulation under the Clean Air Act, and then we'll talk. Thank you very much.